The DJ at the reception had a perfect record. Shannon thought every song he played was one she hated. Of course, she hadn't wanted to come to the wedding in the first place, but since it was Robert's old college roommate who was getting married, she really didn't have an option. Where was her husband anyway? She wondered. Ah, there he was, over by the bar, deep in conversation with some guy she didn't know. This is worse than going to somebody else's high school reunion, she thought morosely. Hey P. A female voice yelled from the doorway, and Shannon's head shot up in surprise. Looking around, she spotted a young woman her own age with a drink in her hand. Tracy, she squealed. What are you doing here? I haven't seen you in forever. The two young women embraced excitedly. Then Tracy turned toward the man who'd accompanied her. Hey Darren, this is Shannon, my best friend forever from back in high school. Shannon, this is Darren, my boyfriend. As Tracy made the introductions, Shannon looked the young man over with interest. He was a little over 6 feet tall with jet black hair combed back from his face, a jaw covered in dark stubble, and a silver earring flashing from one ear. Unlike most of the men at the reception, Darren was clad in tight black jeans and a black leather bomber jacket worn over a black t-shirt. Tracy found herself a bad boy, Shannon thought enviously. The couple joined Shannon at her table, and the two women began to talk animatedly while Darren ignored them and scanned the surroundings in amused contempt. It quickly became apparent to Shannon that Tracy had already hit the bar several times, judging by how loudly she was talking, but Shannon was just glad to see a familiar face in the throng. When their conversation paused, Darren took advantage of the opportunity. He turned to Tracy and pointed at Shannon. You said her name was Shannon. Why'd you call her PK earlier? Tracy laughed a little too loudly. Because she's a preacher's kid, she said, and we never let her forget it. The truth was that there was no way anyone, least of all Shannon, would ever forget that her father was the minister of a Methodist church in suburban Philadelphia. His position meant that she was expected to behave as a role model for others, but like so many offspring of religious figures, she responded by rebelling every chance she got, to her parents' unending dismay. In school, despite being bright and quick to learn, she performed poorly and was a constant disciplinary problem. By the age of 14, she was already sneaking out of the house to meet up with the type of boys her parents did not approve of. She experimented with pot and alcohol, but fortunately did not have a tendency to addiction. She was similarly lucky with sex. A pregnancy scare early on drove home the importance of contraception, and although she continued to be sexually active, she always made her partners use protection. Her parents were not aware of just how loose her morals were, but they despaired of the crowd she ran with, especially the boys she dated. Why can't you find a nice young man? Her mother asked on more than one occasion. But her attempts to set her daughter up with dates she considered more suitable were met with open defiance. It was in Shannon's junior year of high school that an event altered the direction of her life. Her boyfriend at the time had arrived to pick her up for a date, but when Shannon walked out to his car, she found another girl in the front seat. Despite her date's fervent assertions that he was just giving the other girl a ride, Shannon flew into a jealous rage and refused to go, retreating to her room to sulk. Later that night, she was stunned to get a phone call with the news that her boyfriend and the other girl had been killed in an automobile accident. Even though they hadn't liked the boyfriend, Shannon's parents insisted that she go to the funeral. As she sat in the pew during the service, she felt a welter of emotions: sorrow at the boy's death, guilt at the angry thoughts she'd had that night, and most of all, fear at how close she'd come to losing her own life. That last emotion caused her to re-examine her lifestyle and make significant changes. Still a rebel, she nevertheless began to keep her defiance in check. At school, she started to focus on her studies and even got a summer job to bring in some income. She also toned down her partying, being especially careful around drugs and alcohol. As her parents watched their daughter's transformation, they agreed that the accident, tragic as it was, must have been an act of divine intervention. Thanks to her innate intelligence and the work she had put into her last year and a half of high school, Shannon was able to score high enough on the placement test to get into the Community College of Philadelphia. She began commuting to the main campus, working toward a degree in business administration. Emboldened by the changes he saw in his daughter's behavior, Shannon's father began to encourage her to take part in some of the activities for singles that his parish offered. Although she showed little enthusiasm, her father went so far as to introduce her to Robert Cunningham, a young man in his late 20s who had begun attending church there. Robert was tall and clean-cut with wavy brown hair. Although he was handsome enough, Shannon was only mildly attracted to him. He was far too preppy and conventional for a young rebel drawn to bad boys. However, her attitude changed after she learned that the quiet young man was an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Numerous movies and television shows filled her head with images of danger and daring, and her interest in him grew accordingly. Robert, in turn, was entranced by the attractive young woman, and the fact that she seemed to share his attitudes and values only increased his desire. Soon the two of them were a couple, and Shannon's parents could hardly contain their joy that their prodigal daughter had returned to the fold. By the time Shannon graduated from community college, she and Robert were engaged and living happily ever after. Shannon told Tracy about her life, and her friend instantly picked up on the sarcasm in Shannon's voice. "So where's your hubby anyway?" she asked. "Shannon, you mean SpongeBob SquarePants," Shannon replied with barely concealed contempt. "What did you call him?" Tracy asked with a giggle. "SpongeBob SquarePants," Shannon repeated. "I call him that because he's a total square and he's spunning all the fun out of my life," she said bitterly. Tracy couldn't help but laugh. "Come on, Shannon, I thought you married a cross between the Lone Ranger and Elliot Ness," she teased. Her words clearly provoked Shannon. "It's more like I married a CPA," she said spitefully. "No, that's not fair. An accountant would be more exciting than Robert. I don't know what he does. He never talks about his work. When he comes home, all he wants to do is relax and hang around the house. There's no excitement in my life. No fun at all." She was about to say more when she spotted her husband heading their way. Robert had been talking on his cell phone and now had an apologetic look on his face. Before he could speak, Shannon introduced him to Tracy and her date. "Tracy is my best friend from high school," she said, and Tracy grinned. Robert shook hands and then turned back to Shannon. "Honey, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to make an early evening of it. I'm on call tonight, and something has come up at work." Shannon had been none too excited about the wedding reception, but the idea of spending another night at home watching television just added to her foul mood. Before she could respond, however, Tracy intervened. "You don't have to take her home, Robert. Darren and I can give her a lift. Let her hang with us for a while." Robert looked at Tracy uncertainly. Shannon hadn't told him much about her high school days, but his impression of Tracy wasn't wholly positive. He wondered how much the young woman had had to drink, although her boyfriend seemed sober enough. Something about him made Robert uneasy. As he hesitated, Shannon chimed in. "Come on, Robert, I really don't want to sit around the house all by myself on a Saturday night. When the reception is over, I'll catch a ride back with Tracy and Darren." "All right," he said finally, "but it'll probably be pretty late when I get in, so don't wait up for me, honey." With that, he kissed her and then went to pay his respects to the bride and groom. As soon as the door closed behind him, Shannon turned back to Tracy with a look of gratitude on her face. "Thanks, girlfriend. I would have screamed if I'd had to spend another night at home." "Let's go get another drink," Tracy suggested. Before they could do so, Darren spoke up. "You don't really want to hang around this morgue, do you? Let's go somewhere and have some fun." "Yeah," Tracy enthused, her eyes shining. "Let's blow this place and go find a little excitement." Shannon hesitated momentarily. This wasn't exactly what she told Robert she would do. But then she dismissed her reservations. "If he's going to go off and play G-Man, there's no reason why I can't go out and have a good time for a change." As the three of them went outside, Shannon was surprised to see Darren and Tracy heading for a motorcycle. "I haven't ridden on one of those in years," she exclaimed. "Can we all fit on it?" "Sure," Tracy said enthusiastically. "You get behind Darren, and I'll sandwich you in." "What about helmets?" Shannon asked. Darren laughed. "Helmets are for wimps." He swung his leg over the bike and then turned around to look at Shannon as she hiked up her skirt and climbed on behind him. The thrill of doing something daring made her feel a jolt of excitement, and she couldn't help but wonder if this bad boy found her attractive. As soon as Tracy had settled in behind her, Darren took off, revving the powerful engine and peeling away from the wedding party. When he took a sharp turn at high speed, Shannon squealed involuntarily, a mix of fear and exhilaration gripping her as she clung tightly to the seat in front of her. Darren turned to give her a knowing grin, and Shannon couldn't help but wish her husband were more like him. By the time they arrived at their destination, the vibrations from the bike and the closeness of Darren had stirred something within Shannon. As she swung off the bike, she reminded herself, somewhat regretfully, that Darren belonged to Tracy. When the three of them entered through the street-level door, Shannon realized they had arrived at a dance club. The pounding music and flashing lights immediately transported her back to her wilder days, and she almost skipped across the floor as they moved through the semi-darkness. Tracy headed straight for the bar, calling out, "Hey, I want to do some shots. How about you guys?" Before Shannon could answer, Darren grabbed her hand and leaned in to speak into her ear above the noise. "Want to try something way better than booze?" he asked. "You'll like it, I promise." Shannon pulled back and looked into his eyes, which seemed to pierce through her. She felt a sudden urge to prove herself to him. "Okay, what is it?" she asked. He grinned and said, "Allow me to introduce you to Molly." When Shannon looked at him in confusion, he quickly produced 2 pastel-colored tablets from his pocket. He took one and swallowed it with ease. After a moment's hesitation, Shannon decided to follow suit and took her own tablet. "You're going to love Molly," Darren said with a laugh, making Shannon feel as though they were conspirators. He then turned toward the bar, corralled Tracy, and shouted over the music, "Come on, let's dance." The three of them squeezed into the crowd and began dancing together. At one point, Shannon leaned and yelled into Darren's ear, "What about Tracy? Doesn't she like Molly?" Darren shook his head. "Booze is her thing," he yelled back. Sure enough, Tracy soon disappeared, only to return clutching another shot glass. After dancing for a while, Shannon began to feel a sense of warmth and well-being envelop her. The music seemed to meld with her mellow mood, and the rhythms of the lights blended with the motion of her body. She moved closer to Darren and Tracy, and the three of them felt like one entity. The sensation was amazing, and unlike anything she had felt before. Eventually, she noticed that Tracy had found a vacant chair and had passed out. Darren went to check on her, but quickly returned to focus his attention on Shannon. A euphoric feeling washed over her, and as the music continued, she wished the night would never end. Sometime later, she groggily watched as Darren picked up Tracy's unconscious body and tossed it over his shoulder. He then took Shannon's hand and led her outside to his motorcycle. He propped Tracy on the seat in front of him, draped her over the handlebars, and motioned for Shannon to swing on behind him. As he fired up the bike, Shannon was unaware of how much time had passed, only that she was exhilarated by the rush of the wind, the vibrations through the seat, and the warmth of Darren's body in front of her. Eventually, they stopped at an apartment building in the city. Darren carried Tracy inside while Shannon followed. Once inside, Darren unceremoniously placed the unconscious woman on the couch. Shannon came up behind him, wrapping herself around him and swaying to the music still playing in her head. Darren looked at her with a hungry expression, and Shannon felt a matching heat within her. Without a word, he pulled her into the bedroom and began kissing her passionately. She ran her hand over the front of his jeans and started to frantically tug at his belt. In their haste, they tumbled onto the unmade bed, their encounter rough and intense. When Shannon finally opened her eyes, she saw Darren pulling on his clothes. She lifted herself on her elbows and stared at him groggily. "That was incredible," she said. "It felt like we were at it forever. Just how long did it last?" He glanced at his watch and smirked. "About 2 hours." Shannon's mind reeled. No way we were having sex for 2 solid hours. He gave her a sly grin. "I told you you'd like Molly." She slumped back down on the bed. "I will never be the same," she said, exhaustion setting in. Then the implications of what he had just told her sank in. "What time is it?" she asked apprehensively. "Nearly 2, he said over his shoulder. She gasped. 2 a.m. My God, I've got to get home. By the time she had frantically pulled on her clothes, Darren was waiting for her. As they hurried through the living room to the apartment door, Shannon noticed Tracy still passed out on the couch. Thank God for that, she thought guiltily, not wanting to face the girlfriend she had just betrayed. The trip to her house took only 15 minutes, but to Shannon, it felt like an hour. As they rode, she desperately tried to come up with a plausible excuse for why she was so late, but her thoughts were too jumbled. When Darren pulled up in front of Shannon's home, she quickly swung off the bike. She wanted to say something to him, but her emotions were too chaotic. All she could manage was a muttered, "Thanks." Darren grinned and pulled away from the curb with a wave. As Shannon turned toward the house, the fear she had been suppressing hit her fully. She tried to unlock the door quietly, hoping that Robert would be asleep. If she could slip into bed without waking him, she thought, maybe she could come up with an excuse in the morning. To her surprise, when she peeked into the bedroom, Robert wasn't there. She thanked her father's God for this unexpected blessing and hastily tore off her clothes in the dark, hiding them in the bottom of the laundry basket. She wanted to take a shower but didn't dare risk it in case Robert came home and realized how late she'd been out. Instead, she threw on her nightgown and dove into bed, heaving a deep sigh of relief at her close call. Just how lucky she was became clear when she heard Robert's key in the door only a few minutes later. A frightening thought crossed her mind. What if he wants to make love? She had worn her panties to bed and stuffed tissues in them to avoid staining the sheets, but nothing would save her if he began groping her. Then it came to her. The best way to avoid such a catastrophe was to take the initiative herself, but not with passion, rather with anger. So when he tiptoed into the bedroom, she reached over and switched on the bedside lamp. "Where in the hell have you been?" She stormed at him so fiercely that he involuntarily took a step back. "I told you," he stammered. "I had to go out on business." "You've used that excuse too many times before," she snapped back. "I'm beginning to think you're seeing someone." He looked aghast. "No, honey, I'd never do anything like that. I love you." But she was on a roll now and not about to back down. "Well, if you're not seeing someone, tell me what you were doing," she demanded. "I can't do that, honey," he pleaded. "Can't or won't," she replied obstinately. It had been a long, hard night for Robert, and his wariness and frustration at his wife's accusations overcame his reticence. "It was a crime scene," he said wearily. "I had to go investigate." Inwardly, Shannon rejoiced that her tactics were working, but she didn't want to let him off the hook so quickly. "Crime happens every day, Robert. What made this so special that you had to be out until all hours of the night?" He sighed in resignation and began speaking in a low, cold voice. "You really want to know? All right then. It was a murder, actually, a double hit. 2 guys we've been after for a long time got executed tonight. Whoever did it hauled them out to a landfill, put a gun to their heads, and killed them." Resignation turned to resentment in Robert as he continued. "They put bags over their heads, tie their hands behind them, and forced them to kneel in the garbage before they shot them. You know why they put bags over their heads?" Shannon shrank back at his vehemence. "I guess so they couldn't see the faces of the men who kidnapped them," she ventured. "They didn't give a damn if their victims saw them," Robert said in an angry tone. "Have you ever seen a bullet hit a melon? The same thing happens when you shoot a man in the head. They put bags over their heads to keep the brains from splattering everywhere. He shook his head at the memory and stared off into space. Both of them were shot in the back of the head. When the medical examiner pulled the bags off, there wasn't much left of their faces. Anyway, that's what I was out doing while you and your friends were having fun at the wedding reception. Are you satisfied now? Shannon said nothing, but her pale face and wide eyes made clear the impact his story had made. Robert quickly finished undressing, climbed into bed, and pointedly turned his back to her. She switched off the bedside light and pulled the covers around her, pleased that her strategy had successfully diverted his attention. What a wild night, she thought as she rolled over to go to sleep. As she drifted off, the image that filled Shannon's mind was not her encounter with Darren, but the execution-style slaying that Robert had described. Her last conscious thought was a wish that she hadn't pushed Robert quite so far. Shannon slept until noon the next morning. When she finally woke, Robert was cool toward her, but he began to warm up as the afternoon went on. Yet, instead of feeling relieved that his anger had faded, Shannon just felt depressed. Saturday night had been an exciting and satisfying adventure, but now her life was slipping back into its mundane routine, leaving her even more restless. Her encounter with Darren had rekindled impulses and desires she hadn't felt since high school. Returning to her humdrum existence seemed almost unbearable. She was still feeling down when she left for work the next morning, though that was usually how work made her feel. Her business administration degree had landed her a position as an administrative assistant to the director of procurement services at the school district of Philadelphia. She didn't like the director, who was a lecher constantly trying to sneak peeks down her blouse or up her skirt. But she was glad to have the job, and she made sure to give her boss a few inadvertent looks to ensure a good annual evaluation. Nevertheless, the work was mostly monotonous, and she had quickly grown tired of it. This Monday, however, held a surprise when the director went out to the lobby to greet a visitor and brought him back to the office. Shannon almost gasped. The visitor was none other than Darren. He was dressed in a suit and tie, his hair combed back conservatively, and the silver earring was gone. But there was no mistaking him. A slight grin crossed Darren's face when he saw Shannon, but he didn't say anything or give any other sign of recognition as the two men went into the director's office and the door closed behind them. Shannon's mind raced with memories of Saturday night and questions about Darren's unexpected appearance and his meeting with her boss. Curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked on the intercom system while carefully turning down the volume. The office had an old system that allowed the director to give her instructions without leaving his desk. Shannon had figured out how to use it for eavesdropping. It was risky, but she couldn't resist. As she listened to their conversation, she became more perplexed. Darren seemed to be no more than another salesman trying to sell cleaning and office supplies to the school system. She could hardly believe that Saturday night's bad boy on a motorcycle was a soap salesman by day. But the longer she listened, the more something seemed off about their negotiations. Darren confidently told her boss that he represented a new business trying to establish a relationship with the school system. Although the director didn't seem particularly receptive at first, the tone of the conversation changed. "Our company is eager to show you how competitive we can be," Darren said smoothly. "So eager, in fact, that we're prepared to make you a very special offer. It's not unusual for us to do business through a broker, and when we do, we pay the broker a 10% commission. Since there's no broker in this case, we'd be willing to offer you that same commission as a token of appreciation for helping us get our foot in the door." Shannon could hear the director rocking back in his chair and imagine the expression on his face. "You said a 10% commission?" the director asked, as though barely interested. "And what would be the limit on the order size?" "No limit at all, Mr. Director," Darren answered smoothly. "The commission would remain the same and apply to any size order. If you wanted a year's supply for the entire school district, we'd be happy to accommodate you." "And how would this commission be paid?" Shannon's boss asked, a little too quickly. "Our company is not big on procedures and red tape," Darren replied glibly. "I could bring you a cashier's check, if that would be satisfactory." There was a long pause, and Shannon wondered what was happening. Then she heard her boss start up again. "We at the procurement office are always interested in developing new resources for the district's needs. I think we'd like to place an order with your firm for this amount." The intercom clearly picked up the sound of a sheet of paper being slid across the desk. "Very good, sir," Darren replied. "I'll have your commission check ready late tomorrow morning." Shannon thought she heard the two men shake hands, assuming their negotiations were done. But then Darren spoke up again, this time in a slightly different tone. "Mr. Director, there is one other consideration I need to inform you about. Our company has experienced some unfortunate changes of heart, you might say, in the past from others to whom we've made a similar offer." Darren's voice, silky and smooth, cut through the tension. "We've paid the commission only to have the order canceled or sharply reduced. Consequently, our company now requires simultaneous payment for the order. Moreover, since we're paying the commission by cashier's check, it's only fair that the order be paid for the same way." Shannon heard the director's chair squeak as he sat upright abruptly. "This is most unusual," the director grumbled. "I don't even know if I have the authority to issue a cashier's check, especially for such a large amount." "You're right." Darren's voice was smooth as ever. "It is unusual. But so is the commission we're offering you. I'm sure you'd find it quite useful right now. Of course, if you need to adjust the size of your order to fit departmental standards, I would certainly understand." There was another long pause, and Shannon listened intently. Finally, the director spoke up. No, I think we can handle that. But be sure you're back here before noon. I have a luncheon to attend tomorrow, and I don't know how late it will run." Shannon, knowing the director had no such luncheon on his schedule, realized he wanted to deposit that check as quickly as possible. She quickly shut off the intercom and pretended to be hard at work at her computer as the two men emerged from the director's office. "Thank you again, sir. I look forward to a long and mutually rewarding relationship between our organizations," Darren said with enthusiasm, then turned and left without acknowledging Shannon. As she drove home that afternoon, Shannon couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. While she wasn't surprised that Darren might offer a bribe to secure the district's business, she found it hard to reconcile this with the image of him as a sales rep, even a crooked one. The mention of cashier's checks added another layer of confusion. Why risk the deal by insisting on that payment method? Her thoughts shifted to the director, and she shook her head in disgust. It was no surprise that the old lecher was willing to accept a bribe. For a moment, she considered reporting what had happened, but the thought quickly passed. It wasn't her problem. Her thoughts kept returning to Darren. His appearance at her workplace had stirred up a flood of emotions she struggled to control. That night, she dreamt about him. The next morning, when Darren arrived at the building, the director rushed out to greet him like a celebrity. "No interruptions, Shannon," he barked, making Shannon struggle to control her grimace. As soon as the two men disappeared behind the closed door, she quickly switched on the intercom. When the director asked if he had the commission, Darren's voice sounded oily and confident. "I do," Darren replied. "And just to show you how confident my company is in you and the school district, let me present our cashier's check before I even see your order and your payment." Shannon could almost see the scene unfold as the director eagerly accepted the check and scanned it. After a brief pause, she heard him say, "Everything seems to be in order." "Very well, here's our check along with our order and the amount we discussed yesterday. I had to pull some strings to get a cashier's check for this amount, but here it is." "Thank you, sir," Darren replied smoothly. "You won't regret it. And let me remind you that our arrangement will remain in place for any future orders as well. You'll see, this will be a very profitable arrangement for all of us." "Very good," the director said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get to that lunch." The two men then reappeared in the anteroom, and the director told Shannon he was off to lunch. She nodded and said she would take her lunch break as well. As soon as the men were gone, Shannon grabbed her coat and hurried to her car. Navigating through lunch-hour traffic, she wondered what she was getting into but continued driving until she arrived outside the shabby apartment she remembered from Saturday night. She sat in her car, waiting, hoping she had read the situation correctly. It wasn't long before Darren arrived and walked toward the front door. Shannon quickly got out of her car and ran toward him. "Darren, wait," she called out. He turned, his face first showing surprise, then wariness. "Hello, Shannon. You might as well come inside," he said, holding the door for her. Once inside, with no one else present, Darren turned to her, arms crossed. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Shannon ignored the question and said, "I listened to you. I heard everything you and the director talked about. I know you bribed him." "So," Darren asked, his tone surly, "are you going to turn me in?" Shannon ignored the question again and added, "I think there's more going on than bribery. I don't believe you're a soap salesman. I think you're a con man. I think that check you gave him wasn't any good," Shannon said, her voice steady. Darren's mouth curved into a crooked grin, but his eyes remained cold. "You're smarter than I thought. Yes, the whole deal was a con, and the check I gave him was as phony as a politician's promise. But the check he gave me from the school district was good as gold, and I've already cashed it." "What happens when the director tries to cash his check and finds out it's fake?" Shannon asked. "Won't he come after you?" Darren's grin grew more insolent. "That's the beauty of this particular sting. He's screwed no matter what. The only way he can report me is by admitting he took a bribe, and he probably won't be willing to do that until he has to explain why there haven't been any shipments of cleaning supplies. By then, I'll be long gone." Darren's eyes narrowed. "So, how much do you want to keep quiet?" "I don't want your money," Shannon said evenly. Darren looked visibly surprised. "No? Then what do you want?" Shannon met his gaze with intensity. "I want you to take me with you." Darren's surprise turned into contemplation. Then his smile returned. "Are you sure? Do you really want to leave your loving husband, your nice home in the suburbs, and your 9-to-5 job?" he asked mockingly. "Do you really want to give all that up to run with me?" A fierce look crossed Shannon's face. "I think I've been looking for someone like you my whole life," she said huskily, throwing herself against him and kissing him passionately. Darren's hands gripped her hips, pulling her closer. Shannon began to pant, but before things could go further, Darren grabbed her by the hair and yanked her head back, staring into her eyes. "I'm leaving town right away. I'll be outside your house in an hour. If you're not ready, I'm not waiting." "We're leaving on your motorcycle," Shannon said breathlessly. "No, I'll be in a car," Darren corrected. "Sometimes you have to leave your toys behind when you live this kind of life." "What about Tracy?" Shannon asked. "Like I said, you have to be ready to leave your toys behind. Now get going and be outside your place at 1:30, or I'll leave you behind as well." Shannon kissed him again and then dashed for the door. She quickly drove to the nearest bank branch, withdrew money from her checking and joint savings accounts, and then sped home. Once there, she grabbed a suitcase and a makeup bag, hastily packing the essentials she couldn't live without. On her way back downstairs, she picked up a piece of paper to write Robert a note but struggled with what to say. Finally, she scribbled a simple "sorry" and left the note on the kitchen counter along with her wedding ring. She went to the front porch to wait for Darren. As she sat on the steps, doubt began to creep in. This was the most impulsive thing she had ever done, and her conscience screamed at her to stop before it was too late. But then, an undistinguished sedan pulled up in front of her house. With a soaring heart, she ran to the car, leaving the apartment door unlocked. She tossed her bags into the back and slid into the passenger seat as Darren pulled away from the curb. As they drove off, Shannon's thoughts drifted to Robert. She felt a pang of guilt. He truly loved her, and this would hurt him deeply. She also thought about her parents and how disappointed they would be when they found out. But she pushed these thoughts aside with determination. It was her life, and she was taking control. The next few months were a blur for Shannon. Darren drove south to Wilmington, and they moved into a cheap motel. Their days and nights were a chaotic mix of vacation and honeymoon, filled with smoky nightclubs, a drug-induced haze, and endless, passionate sex. Everything was spontaneous, and Shannon relished the lack of responsibility, the freedom to sleep in after partying all night, and the absence of anyone to answer to. It was like being a teenager again, but without parents to curtail her excesses. She occasionally thought of Robert and her parents, but dismissed those thoughts angrily. That was then, this is now, she told herself. I'm living my life on my terms. So it was a shock when Darren woke her one afternoon and informed her that she would need to get a job. We're low on money, he explained. We need to make some cash. Still groggy, Shannon asked, what do you want me to do? You're going to become a legal secretary, Darren said. But I don't know anything about legal work, Shannon protested. You don't know anything about handling pigeons either, Darren replied calmly. But you will. First, however, we need to go shopping. That afternoon found them at Nordstrom in a Christian mall, southwest of downtown Wilmington. As Shannon navigated through the women's department, she noticed Darren strolling several aisles away. Continuing her shopping, she soon found a black Alexander W. pencil skirt with a zippered slit at the side. It looked ideal, so she asked the salesgirl for her size. The fit was perfect. After trying it on, Shannon hung the skirt back on the rack, leaving it slightly askew. She told the salesgirl she wanted to shop some more and moved on to blouses. Shannon focused on a white, long-sleeved blouse that seemed appropriate for the office. Remembering Darren's instructions, she tried on one size smaller than usual. After admiring herself in the mirror, she returned the blouse to the rack, leaving it protruding slightly. Next, she made her way to the shoe department, where she tried on several styles before selecting a pair of elegant black high-heeled pumps. Despite the $300 price tag, she purchased them with cash. Shannon then strolled to the food court and took a seat. Moments later, Darren joined her, carrying a large bag from Champ Sports. Did you get everything? She asked anxiously. When Darren nodded, she added, shouldn't we get out of here? Nah, Darren said dismissively. We're clear. How can you be so sure? Shannon asked. Simple, he replied. Stores aren't looking for a man to shoplift women's clothing. Someone might have seen you browsing, but they usually don't pay much attention to a man in the women's department. Besides, the expensive shoes serve a purpose. What purpose? She asked, still uneasy. 3 reasons, Darren explained. First, salespeople in footwear keep a close eye on the merchandise, so shoes are hard to swipe. Second, expensive footwear usually has ID chips that must be disabled before they leave the store. And third, if anyone was suspicious of you, they'd forget about you once you made a purchase. A shoplifter wouldn't buy anything, especially something that costly. Despite Darren's reassurances, Shannon felt relieved when they finally returned to their motel. Darren turned on the Weather Channel, watching for a few minutes before turning off the TV. Looks like tomorrow will be a good day for hunting pigeons, he said. Here's what we're going to do. Shannon was uneasy about becoming a part of Darren's con game. It was one thing to go along for the ride with him. It was quite another to actively participate. Yet, she saw no way to avoid it. At noon the next day, she made her way nervously down Delaware Avenue toward DuPont Park. She was dressed in the clothes Darren had shoplifted the previous day, hoping she looked like the secretary she was supposed to be. She spotted Darren on the opposite side of the street and half a block ahead of her. As she reached the small park, Darren made a subtle gesture, and she noticed a man seated on a bench near the fountain. She glanced back at Darren for confirmation, and when he nodded, she approached the stranger. He appeared to be in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair, wearing an older-style suit with noticeable wear at the cuffs and collar. Taking a deep breath, Shannon said, "Excuse me, sir. I think you dropped this," holding up an oversized, unmarked business envelope. The man looked at her and then at the envelope, taking the opportunity to give her a second glance. "No, I'm sorry, young lady, that doesn't belong to me," the old man said with a smile. "Are you sure?" Shannon asked, pointing out that she had found it under the bench where he was sitting. He shook his head again and said, "No, it's not mine, but thank you for asking." Shannon sat down beside him on the bench and watched as his eyes drifted to the slit in her skirt. "What should we do about this envelope?" she asked. "It feels heavy." She passed the envelope to him, and he took it into his hands. After a moment, he handed it back to her. "Maybe there's an address or something inside that will tell us who it belongs to," she suggested, meeting his gaze. "That's a good idea," he said, clearly enjoying the interaction with her. When Shannon unclasped the envelope and peeked inside, she gasped. "Oh my gosh, it's filled with money," she exclaimed, thrusting the envelope back into his hands. His eyes widened as he discovered the contents. "How much is in there?" Shannon asked excitedly. The man looked down at the stacks of bills in his lap, his eyes widening. "These are packets of $100 bills," he said in a hushed voice. He quickly began to count the money, and once finished, he turned to her and said, "There are 20 packets, and each one has 25 bills. That means there's $50,000 in here." Shannon's eyes widened. "Can we keep it? I mean, there's no name on the envelope and nothing inside to indicate who it belongs to. That would be $25,000 for each of us." The desire was evident in his eyes, but he wasn't fully convinced. "I think we have to report this to the authorities in case someone lost it," he said. Seeing her disheartened expression, he added, "But maybe if no one claims it, we can keep it." Shannon's eyes lit up as an idea struck her. "My boss is an attorney. He works in that building right across the street. Let me call him. He'll know what to do." Before her companion could respond, Shannon pulled out her cell phone and called her boss. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned back to the man. "He said he was on his way to a meeting, but will stop by on the way to see us. Oh, look, there he comes now." She pointed to Darren, who was appropriately dressed in a dark blue suit, white shirt, and striped tie, carrying a heavy legal briefcase. After introductions, Shannon explained the situation. Darren took the envelope, briefly checked inside, and looked down at Shannon and the older man. "I know exactly what this is," Darren said confidently. "I've seen it before. This is drug money. Someone was going to make a payoff, and something went wrong." "What do we do now?" Shannon asked. "We'll have to notify the police, of course," Darren replied. "But I'm happy to inform you that once a few formalities are completed, the money belongs to the finders." Shannon squealed in delight and hugged Darren. He returned her embrace warmly. "Before you get too excited," Darren interrupted, "there's one small complication." The two seated on the bench looked at each other in alarm before turning back to Darren. "The problem," he continued, "is that an unmarked envelope is a common ploy used by drug dealers to launder money. They claim to have found it, and when it goes unclaimed, they take possession and end up with clean money." "But we're not drug dealers," the older man protested. "I know that," Darren responded, "but you need to convince the police, not me." He paused, letting the realization sink in before continuing. "I think I know a way. If each of you were to contribute some of your own money, it would demonstrate your good faith to the police. Besides, no drug dealer would put up their own cash like that." Seeing the doubt in the older man's face, Shannon quickly spoke up. "That makes sense to me. How much would we have to put up to show good faith?" "What would be ideal," Darren said, "is if each of you could contribute half of the total money. That would clearly show the police that you're honest and not trying to pull a money laundering scheme." Shannon spoke up again. "I had a little over $25,000 in my savings account at the bank across the street. If it means a chance to double that, I'm willing to get it, especially since we're going to give it to the police." She turned to her companion. "What about you? Can you do the same?" When he hesitated, Shannon hurriedly added, "My husband and I could really use $25,000. I bet that much money would come in handy for you too. Yes, it would, the older man agreed. After a moment of decision, he added, my bank is just down the street. I could pull $25,000 out of my retirement account. Perfect, Darren said. Now here's what you need to do. Each of you needs to withdraw the money while I contact the police. Be sure to have your bank put the money in an envelope with the withdrawal receipt and seal it. That way, there can be no question where the money came from. Then get back here as quickly as you can. Shannon grabbed the older man's hand and excitedly tugged him off the bench. Come on, let's go, she said. He gladly held her hand as they walked out of the park. After crossing the street, he somewhat reluctantly released her to head to his bank. Shannon waited with her envelope. When the gray-haired man returned, puffing from his haste, Darren took the big envelope they had found and opened it to show them the $50,000 inside. He then added the envelopes from Shannon and the older man, closed the flap, and sealed it. There, Darren said triumphantly. Now the police will know it hasn't been tampered with. He checked his watch and pulled out his cell phone. Turning away, he made a call, and it was clear from one side of the conversation that something was amiss. Darren turned back to them, holding his finger over the phone speaker. There's been an accident, and the detectives have been delayed. It'll be about 15 minutes before they can get here. He looked around and then back at them. Listen, I don't feel comfortable holding this much money out in the open like this. We need to put it in a safer place, Darren said, turning to the older man. Is your car parked nearby? The gray-haired man nodded quickly. Yes, I'm parked on the first level of the parking garage right over there. Good, Darren said approvingly. We'll go over there and lock the envelope in the trunk of your car. I'll let the police know where to look for you. With that, they walked across the street and into the garage, with the older man leading the way. There's my car, he said, pointing to a Chevrolet in the middle of one row. As they neared the car, there was a clatter of metal on concrete, and Shannon let out a little squeal. Oh, I dropped my phone, she said, bending over carefully to pick it up. When she stood up, she saw the older man had been watching her. She held the phone out to him. Do you think it will be okay? He took the phone from her to examine it, and Shannon watched over his shoulder as Darren switched the envelope with the money for an identical one from his briefcase. As Shannon and her friend turned back toward Darren, he held up the envelope and asked the older man to open his trunk. Darren ostentatiously placed the envelope inside, slammed the lid close, and asked the man to lock the car again. Now I feel better, Darren said reassuringly. I'm sorry, but if I don't hurry, I'll be late for my meeting. The police should be here any minute, so you two just wait for them by the car. Before they could say anything else, Darren hurried away. The older man looked around uneasily, and Shannon quickly gripped his arm. So tell me, she asked with an encouraging smile, what are you going to do with all that money? The man eagerly began talking about European vacations and other dreams, with Shannon nodding and smiling in agreement. When he paused for breath, Shannon's expression shifted to discomfort. Darn it, I really need to go to the bathroom. I'm going to run to the bank's ladies' room, and then I'll be right back. She leaned over and gave him a kiss on the cheek. Don't go away now, she said with a smile before hurrying toward the door to the lobby. Instead of stopping, she rushed straight through the lobby and out of the building. Turning west, she walked down the street until she reached an alley where Darren was parked with the engine running. When he pulled away, she was almost shaking from the adrenaline rush. How did I do? She asked excitedly. Like a pro, baby, like a pro, Darren responded with a chuckle. That's how you do the pigeon drop. He laughed. I wish you could have seen it when you bent over to pick up your phone. That old guy's eyes almost popped out of his head, staring at your hips. How long before he opens the trunk and finds the envelope stuffed with newspaper? She asked. Long after we're out of here, Darren said with a grin. Shannon laughed giddily and settled back in her seat as they drove to the motel. When they arrived, Darren turned to her. You go on inside and wait for me. I've got to make a quick trip to the bank. What bank? She asked, confused. "The Bank of Moscow," Darren said calmly. "The Bank of Moscow?" she asked in surprise. "I've never heard of it. Why do you have to go there?" "It's better that you don't know," Darren replied curtly. When he saw her frown, he hurried on. "When I get back, we'll go out and party." As Shannon waited, she began to reflect on what they had just done. Now that the thrill of the con had worn off, she felt a pang of guilt for the old man they had just robbed. Memories of his well-worn clothes came to mind, and she felt a wave of remorse. She pushed the thoughts away angrily. He probably has tons of money stashed away. He won't miss it, she told herself, though she felt a bit depressed. She had wanted the excitement of being with a bad boy, but she hadn't anticipated becoming an active participant in his schemes. "My dad would just die if he knew," she thought. And so would Robert. The thought made her angry at herself. "Why should I even care what they think?" she asked herself in disgust. To lift her spirits, she fished a joint out of Darren's bag and lit it. By the time Darren returned, she was high, giggly, and hungry. Darren was amused. "Come on, baby," he said. "Let's go get something to eat, and then we'll have a little playtime." A week later, Darren informed Shannon it was time for them to move on. "We're leaving as soon as I get back," he told her. When she asked where he was going, he only said it was a business meeting. After Darren returned, they quickly loaded their bags into their nondescript car. Darren drove to the motel office, settled their bill, and then got behind the wheel, heading north on I-95. "Are we going back to Philadelphia?" Shannon asked. "No," Darren replied curtly. "Where then?" Shannon asked curiously. "Newark," Darren said. "We've got a big business opportunity there," Darren replied. "What opportunity?" Shannon pressed. Darren sighed audibly. "All right, we've got some time ahead of us, so I guess now is as good a time as any to explain. Remember the con I pulled in Philly with the school board?" he asked, glancing at Shannon. "Of course," she replied. "Well, there's a similar situation in Newark, but on a much larger scale. If we play our cards right, we might be able to make a really big score, one that could set us up comfortably for a long time." "Why not Wilmington?" Shannon asked, puzzled. "What's so special about Newark?" Darren rolled his eyes and began to explain. "Newark runs the biggest education system in New Jersey, but it has one of the worst graduation rates in the state. The system got so bad that the state government took it over back in 1995 and has been running it ever since. It's also underfunded and rife with corruption." "That doesn't sound very promising to me," Shannon said. "You'd think so, but there's another side to it," Darren continued. "The problems are so well known that the system has received a lot of money from well-meaning donors trying to help. That guy who started Facebook donated $100 million, and other rich people have chipped in as well. Everyone's looking for ways to jumpstart the system, and that's where we come in." Shannon's confusion was evident. "What does this have to do with us?" "The latest quick fix they're trying is giving computers to students to help with their schoolwork," Darren explained. "But you know they'll just end up spending all their time on Facebook or playing games." "Maybe so," Shannon said, "but who cares? The point is that it's a big opportunity for us. We offer to sell them a whole shipping container full of iPads at cut-rate prices, and they'll jump at the offer." "Where are we going to find a container full of iPads?" Shannon asked incredulously. "Our friends at the Bank of Moscow already have one," Darren replied. "Okay, now you've got to tell me," Shannon demanded. "Who the hell is the Bank of Moscow?" "It's not really a bank," Darren said. "That's just what I call it because they're willing to fund scams and underwrite other kinds of crime. The truth is, they're part of the Russian mafia." "Why would the Russian mafia want to fund other people's deals? Why not just pull the jobs themselves?" Shannon asked. "Simple," Darren said. "They can make a lot of money without taking any risk. If the con goes sour or the borrowers get arrested, they don't lose anything." "That sounds risky," Shannon said. "They're not like a regular bank," Darren explained. "If you borrow money from them, you pay it back plus interest, no matter what. If you end up in jail, your family has to pay. There's no getting out of the loan from these guys. Shannon wasn't convinced. But what if the family can't pay or won't pay? Darren shuddered. Trust me, you don't want to know what happens then. Let's just say the Bank of Moscow doesn't have a debt problem. They always collect. So where did these Russian guys get a shipping container of iPads? Shannon asked. Darren rolled his eyes, as if speaking to a child. They hijacked it, of course. And they're just going to give it to us? Shannon asked, still not understanding. No, Darren said slowly. They're not going to give it to us. They're going to lend it to us, along with the cash we need as seed money. In return, they get half the proceeds from our little con game. Half. Shannon exploded. We take all the risk, and they get half. It sounds like a lot, I know, Darren said. But think about it. Where else do we have a chance to score $2 million in one deal? $2 million. You're kidding, right? Shannon said. Do the math, Darren said. There are 10,000 iPads in that container, and they're the fancy ones with 128 gigs of memory. They'd retail for $800 each. We sell them to the school system at half price, which makes them look like heroes, and nets us $4 million. We split that with the Bank of Moscow and walk away with a cool $2 million. With that kind of money, we can go anywhere and do anything. Shannon's skeptical look remained. Do you really think you can con the school board into buying stolen merchandise? Darren grinned. Our new partners tell me that the guy we have to deal with is Gordon Sermon, the head of the Newark's Future Today Foundation. This guy is politically ambitious and not too picky about where possible campaign funds come from. They think he's touchable. I don't understand, Shannon said. How are we going to do it? Darren paused, grinning even more broadly. I'm not going to con him. You are. Shannon gasped, startled. I don't know how to do something like that. Don't worry, baby, Darren said. I'll coach you every step of the way. He'll be putty in your hands. The day after they checked into an inexpensive motel near the Newark airport, Darren and Shannon made a trip to Manhattan for another shopping spree. They returned with a complete wardrobe for Shannon, including lingerie from Agent Provocateur, a dark gray Armani women's suit from Saks Fifth Avenue, and a pair of black suede Burberry high-heeled ankle boots. Her only actual purchase was the boots, for which she paid in cash. The rest of the evening was spent going over Shannon's role and how to handle any questions or issues Gordon's Sermon might raise. Darren had already been in contact with Sermon's office at the foundation to set up the appointment and introduce Shannon as Miss April Johnson, Vice President of Sales for Global Resources. All marks are the same, Darren reassured her. If you can get them to focus on the rewards, they'll convince themselves that everything else you're saying is true. Once they start visualizing the prize, they want to believe you. Shannon spent a restless night, nervous about her role and uneasy about her increasing involvement in Darren's schemes. Yet she could see no way to back out. The next morning, jittery and unable to eat, she felt a bit better once she put on her power suit and ankle boots. Before she left for the foundation's offices, Darren reminded her, "Remember, baby, you have a secret weapon. It's hard for a man to say no to someone like you." Once settled in Sermon's office, Shannon launched into a rehearsed pitch. Global Resources, she explained, had acquired a container of 10,000 tablets at distressed prices. These were the deluxe $800 models, but her firm could offer them to the foundation at half price if they took the entire lot. It was a preposterous story, and Shannon was sure Sermon would kick her out soon. However, as she went through her proposition, it became clear that Sermon was paying more attention to her body than her words. To test this, she crossed and uncrossed her legs several times, noticing his focused gaze. Realizing this could work to her advantage, Shannon's confidence grew. She shifted from the deal's details to praising the foundation's work and Sermon's role. As he responded positively, she began to describe the impact of acquiring so many tablets for the school system, the favorable publicity, and the political implications. The people of Newark are looking for a leader who has the vision to address the city's problems and the decisiveness to get things done, she said. This could be a real inflection point for the right man. As she spoke, she leaned toward him, causing her jacket to gape open and reveal glimpses of her bra. My company would be interested in supporting such a leader, she continued smoothly. We'd be prepared to contribute seed money to help get a political campaign in motion. We're talking about 1% of the sale as a sort of commission, which would go a long way toward getting a mayoral campaign rolling. Sermon considered this, then replied slowly, $40,000 would certainly be helpful. Shannon interrupted as Darren suggested, No, Mr. Sermon, not 1% of our price to you. 1% of the retail value. His eyes widened. $80,000. Exactly, she said with a smile. Sermon stared off into the distance, then refocused and narrowed his eyes. You've given me a lot to think about, Miss Johnson. I'd like a bit more time to consider your proposition before coming to a final decision. Shannon's smile broadened. Of course, Mr. Sermon, but you must realize that we have other potential opportunities for moving this merchandise. Rapid inventory turnover is key to our success. Sermon nodded, understanding. Why don't we plan to meet tomorrow at this same time to continue our discussion? Shannon smiled, rose gracefully, and extended her hand. I'll be looking forward to it, she said smoothly. As she left his office, she added a slight sway to her hips. When Shannon returned to Darren, she was bursting with excitement. Oh God, Darren, I think it just might work. He hardly asked any questions, and when I started talking about what this could do for him, you'd have thought I was giving him a hand job. Darren was equally thrilled. You know what this means, Vave? If we can pull this off, we'll walk out of here with $2 million. Darren's excitement led him to grab Shannon and kiss her passionately. Their enthusiasm quickly turned into a heated moment, and they found themselves shedding their clothes in a rush before collapsing onto the unmade bed in a fervor of passion. As Darren immersed himself in the moment, he exulted. Do you miss your old life now? Do you miss good old SpongeBob? Shannon, caught up in the ecstasy, clung to him and declared, The hell with him, the hell with them all. This is what I want. Just give it to me now. The next day, Shannon returned for her follow-up appointment wearing another shoplifted outfit. This one, while still business appropriate, featured a shorter skirt and a blouse with a plunging neckline. She entered Sermon's office with confidence, and his initial response only reinforced her positive outlook. Miss Johnson, I've given your company's proposal a great deal of consideration, and I find it extremely interesting. She thought to herself, he's hooked, working hard to keep her triumph from showing. However, Sermon continued, in the course of my research, I came across an interesting situation I'd like to share with you. About 9 months ago, the school system in Philadelphia contracted to purchase a large quantity of cleaning supplies from a new vendor. When no supplies were ever delivered, an investigation revealed that the head of purchasing had accepted a bribe from the fake supplier. Shannon's excitement quickly turned to fear. Oh God, she thought, he knows about us. The police must be outside, ready to arrest me. Her heartbeat raced, and sweat began to bead down from her armpits. It took all her effort not to bolt for the door. But Sermon continued. What I found particularly interesting was that the bribe was in the form of a cashier's check, which turned out to be as fake as the supply contract itself. Shannon wondered if she might faint. Sermon smiled smugly. The philosopher George Santayana famously said that those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. So rather than risk repeating that ugly lesson, I'm going to accept your proposal, but with 3 conditions. If you cannot meet all 3, then we have nothing further to discuss. Shannon was stunned, struggling to comprehend what was happening. He's not going to arrest me, she thought in confusion. He's actually going to take the deal. Oblivious to her inner turmoil, Sermon went on. Here are my conditions. First, the campaign contribution your company wishes to make must be in cash, delivered concurrently with the merchandise. Shannon's mind raced. How are we going to get $80,000 in cash? But she kept her face impassive as Sermon continued. The second condition is that I need to see the merchandise myself. I'm not buying anything until I see all 10,000 of those iPads. When Shannon remained silent, Sermon cleared his throat. My third condition is of a different, more personal nature. Before we conclude our transaction, you will need to spend a night with me at the Metal Inn Hilton. Shannon gasped, jumping out of her chair in shock. Before she could express her outrage, she took a deep breath, sat back down, and struggled to maintain her composure. I was not expecting something like this from you, Mr. Sermon. I am taken aback by what you're demanding. I believe the best thing for me to do is discuss this with my colleagues. Good day, sir. With that, she rose and stalked to the door. Sermon's parting words made her stop. Please don't take too long thinking it over, Miss Johnson. My offer is time-sensitive. Rapid inventory turnover, you know. Fuming, Shannon said nothing further. When she returned to the motel, her angry scowl made it clear to Darren that things had gone awry. Before she could speak, Darren demanded, "What happened? What went wrong?" When Shannon told him about Sermon's cash demand, Darren didn't see it as an unsolvable problem. I didn't expect that, but I think we can work around it. Let me talk to the Russians and see what they say. He was untroubled by Sermon's requirement to see the merchandise. The Russians have the container at Port Newark. I'll arrange a special showing for Sermon when I call them about the $80,000. This can work for us, Shannon. It'll be okay. Shannon's anger escalated. No, it won't, she shouted, because I'm not going to sleep with that pig. Darren's eyes widened. That's his third condition. He wants to sleep with you. This is great. It means he's in. We've got him, baby. We've got him. Shannon was taken aback by his response. I'm not a hooker, she protested. I don't want to spend the night with that sanctimonious jerk. Darren grabbed her by the shoulders, making her wince. Grow up, Shannon, Darren said. It's time you understand that in this game, you use every trick you've got. Yesterday, you were showing a little cleavage and crossing your legs. Now, just use a little more to seal the deal. Shannon, almost in tears, asked, But what about us? How will you feel if I have to sleep with him? Darren wrapped his arms around her and hugged her tightly. He lifted her chin so he could meet her gaze. Oh, baby, I'll love you even more if you pull this off. This is like winning the World Series. It's huge. One night with a mark means nothing to me. Shannon looked up at him, wanting to believe his reassurances, but she was still troubled. She had never wanted to be part of the con in the first place, and felt increasingly used by Darren. Despite wanting to make him proud and the rewards the job could bring, she struggled with the idea of being used in this way. After a few moments, she reluctantly agreed to do what Darren wanted. With the crisis averted, Darren shifted focus back to Sermon's conditions and proposed a plan. Now that we know we've got him, I think we can use the cash as leverage, he said. Under Darren's guidance, Shannon called Sermon to confirm that the deal was acceptable and agreed to meet him at the hotel 2 nights later. Sermon was clearly excited, but was brought back to reality by Shannon's counter-condition. We have a condition of our own, Shannon said. If you want our campaign contribution in cash, you'll need to pay for the computers in cash as well. Sermon's reaction was one of outrage. How do you expect me to get $2 million in cash? And even if I could, the largest bill in circulation is $100. Do you have any idea how much that would weigh? Shannon put the phone on mute and looked at Darren with a worried expression. Darren told her to hold firm. When she resumed the call, she said, If you can't manage the cash, then give us another option. Otherwise, the deal is off. Sermon's anger simmered down after a few minutes. What about Eurobonds? He proposed. The foundation has a substantial quantity of Eurobonds in its endowment. I could use those for this purchase. Would that work? Shannon looked at Darren, who shrugged uncertainly. He quickly scribbled on a piece of paper and held it up to her. Let me consult with our financial team, Mr. Sermon," Shannon said. "I should be able to call you back within the hour." After hanging up, Darren contacted his Russian contact and explained the situation. After a lengthy conversation, he hung up and shared the news with Shannon. The Russians said Eurobonds are issued by corporations and governments in Europe, and they work like bearer bonds. As long as the bonds are legitimate, they can be redeemed for cash. The Russians use them frequently for money laundering. So, if the bonds are valid, they'll take them. Shannon was uncertain. "So, what does that mean?" Darren began to dance around the room. "It means we've got him," he crowed. "He wants this deal bad. I'll bet he's already drafting his campaign announcement." Shannon, after her initial elation, found her emotions fluctuating. Darren's praise made her feel important, but at times she felt like a pawn in his game, used for his purposes. The idea of being forced into this role stung deeply. Despite her reservations, she found herself walking through the lobby of the Metal Inn Hilton 2 days later. She wore a dark gray maxi dress that fluttered around her heels and hugged her figure enticingly. The standout feature was the cowl back that revealed her braeless back. The outfit, which Darren had helped her select, was both sexy and sophisticated. Arriving early, she positioned herself on the far side of the lobby. When she saw Sermon approach, she turned away, allowing the arch of her back to be visible. Sermon nearly rushed to her side, eager to meet her. During dinner, accompanied by several bottles of wine, Sermon spoke extensively about the Foundation's achievements, attributing all successes to his leadership. Shannon pretended to be engrossed, but her thoughts drifted as she caught sight of a man who resembled her father. The resemblance triggered memories of her father's lectures. "You can't do that, Shannon. Good girls don't act that way. You don't want people talking about you." As these memories surfaced, her teenage rebelliousness returned. "I'll do what I want," she thought defiantly. The reluctance she had previously felt evaporated, and she began to embrace the idea of playing her role in the scheme. Impulsively, she leaned across the table and interrupted Sermon's monologue. "That's very interesting," she said with a seductive tone, "but wouldn't you like to take a bottle of wine upstairs and continue the conversation in your room?" The spark in her eyes gave him all the encouragement he needed, and he quickly settled the bill. In the elevator, her newfound assertiveness took over. She grabbed him by the tie and pulled him toward her for a passionate kiss that left Sermon breathless. "I knew you were hot," he moaned. Once inside the room, Shannon continued to take charge. After locking the door, she took several large swigs of wine directly from the bottle. She then pushed Sermon into a chair and slowly slid her dress off her shoulders, letting it fall down her arms. "Screw them," she thought to herself. "Screw them all. Sermon, Darren, Robert, Daddy, all of them." With that, she arched her back and let out a cry as her climax overcame her. The sensations continued, prolonging her pleasure until it finally subsided. She then slumped against Sermon's chest and quickly fell asleep. Several hours later, she awoke, confused and disoriented. The view of Manhattan's lights through the window reminded her of the events of the previous evening. As she became fully awake, a sense of elation washed over her. She reveled in the thought of having successfully seduced and conned Sermon, who would soon hand over $2 million in cash. She fell asleep almost immediately after turning away from the thought. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows brought with it a throbbing hangover and a mouth that felt as if it had decayed. When she looked over the side of the bed, she saw a pair of legs in suit pants and lace-up shoes. Sermon sat down in a nearby chair and said gruffly, "Now let's talk business." The passive demeanor he had shown the night before had vanished. "Here's how it's going to go," he said curtly. "You will meet me at my office at 5 p.m. this afternoon. Bring me $80,000 in cash in a briefcase. Come alone, or the deal is off. I'll have the Eurobonds ready. We'll count the cash and the bonds to make sure everything is legitimate. Afterward, we'll go to a storage locker I've rented. You bring a heavy-duty padlock. I'll have one too. We'll lock the money up so neither of us can pull any tricks. We'll leave the money in the locker while we inspect the merchandise at the container terminal. Once I verify that you have the tablets, we'll return to the storage locker to collect our money." He paused. "Got it." When she nodded, he looked at her intently. "Remember, no tricks," he added. Shannon held his gaze, trying to hide her distaste. "No tricks," she confirmed. Sermon gave her a thin smile and headed for the door, but turned back to add, "Oh, and I was right. You were quite the catch." Shannon stared at him as he left. When she returned to the motel, Darren was waiting impatiently and demanded a detailed account of the encounter. He seemed particularly interested in the intimate details, which confused Shannon. As she described Sermon's outline for the transaction, Darren's expression turned thoughtful. "I'll need to make some adjustments," he said, "but I think we can make this work. Let me talk to the Russians and make some plans." With that, Darren left to make arrangements. Shannon packed their belongings, feeling a deep sense of depression. The rebelliousness from the night before had faded, replaced by self-doubt. Sermon's treatment had made her reflect on the reality of her situation, and she felt a profound sense of shame. Shannon tried to convince herself that she didn't care what others thought, but she wasn't fully convinced. To lift her spirits, she focused on the potential future with the money. "I'd really like to see Paris," she thought, imagining herself strolling by the Eiffel Tower, shopping at exclusive French salons, and dining in fine restaurants. The thought brightened her mood, and she felt almost normal again when Darren returned. Darren entered the motel room carrying a large briefcase. "Okay," he said, "I think we've got it all worked out." He patted the briefcase. "Inside this case are the documents you need. Guard it with your life until it's locked up in that storage unit, because if anything happens to it, the Russians will be on us like a shark on a seal." Shannon shuddered at the imagery and asked, "So, how's it all going to work?" "It's probably better if you don't know," Darren replied. "That way, you can't inadvertently give anything away." Shannon didn't appreciate his lack of confidence in her. But before she could protest, Darren continued, "There's one more bit of acting you'll need to do to seal the deal. After that, we're home free." She listened to his instructions and smiled. "I can do that," she said confidently. Just before 5 p.m., Darren dropped Shannon off outside the Foundation offices. "Remember, baby, in an hour or so, we'll be rich," he encouraged. Shannon walked toward the building, lugging the briefcase. She was surprised by how heavy it was, filled with stacks of $100 bills. Sermon awaited her anxiously. When he tried to take the briefcase, she pulled it back. "Easy, easy," he soothed. "I'm just going to count it." He pointed to a metal-clad carrying case on a nearby table. "The Eurobonds are in there. You can check them if you want." Shannon approached the briefcase, totaling the face value of the bonds. She pulled one from the middle, took a photo of it with her cell phone, and emailed it to the account she'd been given. A few minutes later, her phone rang. A voice with a Slavic accent confirmed, "They're real. You can proceed." Shannon sighed with relief and nodded at Sermon. "All right," Sermon said. "Let's get going." They each picked up their briefcases and went to Sermon's Mercedes. He drove in silence for a few miles until they reached a somewhat run-down self-storage facility. Shannon's doubts must have shown. As Sermon explained, "I chose this place because nobody ever comes here. We won't be disturbed." Sermon stopped in front of a roll-up door, and they both got out. After unlocking it, Shannon saw only a shelf unit along one wall. Sermon slid his briefcase onto the shelf and signaled for her to do the same. "The money will be safe here until we get back from the container terminal," he told her. They exited the storage unit, and Sermon locked the door. Shannon attached the padlock she'd brought, ensuring neither could access it without the other. "Now, let's go check out the tablets," Sermon said. He drove east, then turned south onto Corbin Street and into the port's container terminal. The vast area was filled with brightly colored shipping containers and towering loading cranes. Shannon consulted the directions Darren had given her and directed Sermon to a narrow street lined with containers. They stopped next to a bright blue container. Sermon checked the numbers and handed Shannon a key. He unlocked the padlock and opened one of the two doors. Inside, the container was filled with large boxes bearing the familiar Apple logo. Sermon pulled out a folding knife and opened one box to reveal smaller boxes inside. He opened one and pulled out an iPad, exclaiming with satisfaction. "I told you," Shannon said. Then, following Darren's instructions, she added, "But you'll want to check the boxes in the back just to make sure they're all the same." "Right," Sermon agreed eagerly, climbing over the boxes toward the far end of the container. As he neared the back, Shannon couldn't wait any longer and started trying to close the container door. Hearing the creaking hinges, Sermon turned and yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" He scrambled back toward the front as Shannon struggled to close the door. The locking pole was stuck, and Shannon wasn't strong enough to move it. As Sermon approached, she turned in fear and ran up the alley of cargo containers, eventually reaching the street. She yelled in frustration and rage. Sermon emerged from the container and saw her jump into Darren's waiting car. He quickly ran back to his Mercedes to chase after them. But before he could even get out of the cul-de-sac, an 18-wheeler pulled across the entrance, blocking his way. Sermon angrily jumped out of his car and demanded that the driver move, but the man responded in a language Sermon didn't understand. The driver and his helper began unloading their truck while Sermon stood there, cursing in frustration. Shannon was still shaking as she and Darren drove out of the container terminal and headed for the self-storage unit. "I felt like I was running in tar," she gasped. "I was sure he was going to catch me." Darren just grinned. "You don't need to worry about Sermon," he chuckled. "Those truckers have orders to keep him there an hour before they move their rig. We'll be long gone by then." "Won't he call the police?" Shannon asked anxiously. "And send them to the storage unit to find all that cash and those Eurobonds?" "Not likely," Darren replied. "That would be the end of his political dreams for sure." Darren laughed as they pulled into the self-storage unit, which was deserted. Shannon quickly ran to the door of Sermon's unit and used the key to unlock her padlock. Meanwhile, Darren opened the trunk of his car and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. It took a bit of effort, but the heavy-duty cutters made quick work of the shackle. Darren grabbed the handle and raised the door. "Here we go," he said with glee, and ducked inside. Shannon followed, only to see Darren frantically searching the inside of the small container. He turned around, grabbed Shannon's shoulders, and began to shake her. "Where are the briefcases?" he yelled. "Where's the money?" Shannon twisted free of his grip and went over to the bare shelving unit to look for herself. "We left them right here," she said in confusion. "I know they were here." "Sermon must have taken them," Darren said, grasping for an explanation. "No, he didn't," Shannon shrilled. "I saw them with my own two eyes. They were on the shelf when we locked the door." Darren grabbed his head and began to moan. When he looked up at her, his face had gone pale. "Oh God, oh God," he cried. "This is bad. This is very bad. The Russians will kill us if we don't get them their money." His fear caused Shannon to panic. "It's not our fault, Darren," she cried desperately. "Somebody must have stolen it. The Russians will understand. They have to." "You don't get it," Darren shouted. "These are really bad people. I know what they've done to others who owed them money, and we owe them a pile of it. We're as good as dead." "No," Shannon yelled, grabbing Darren's arm. "We can talk to them. We can pull another con and then pay them back." "Let me go, you stupid," Darren screamed, shoving her so hard that she fell to the concrete floor, bruising her hip. "I've got to get out of here." As she looked up in shock, Darren dashed out of the storage unit and headed straight for the car. "Wait for me," she yelled, struggling to get to her feet, but Darren ignored her and started the engine. Before he could even get the car in motion, two large black SUVs pulled into the driveway, blocking him completely. Several large men ran to the car door and yanked Darren out of the driver's seat. Within seconds, they had bound his hands behind him and thrust him into the back seat of one of the SUVs. As Shannon stood there, paralyzed, rough hands grabbed her arms and twisted them behind her back. Heavy plastic bands tightened around her wrists, and she was propelled toward the opposite door of the same SUV that held Darren. Once inside, another plastic band was wrapped around her ankles, leaving her completely helpless. In terror, she glanced over at Darren only to see one of the men pull a burlap sack over his head. Then her own vision went dark as she felt the rough cloth envelop her face. She began to plead with her captors, but a rough voice ordered her to be quiet, and she obeyed out of fear. As the car sped up, Shannon suddenly remembered Robert's account of the mob execution he had investigated the night she'd met Darren. His description of the double murders came back to her vividly, and she began to sob in terror at the thought of her face being blown off inside the burlap bag. Hot, burning tears flooded down her cheeks, and mucus ran over her upper lip and into her mouth. She gasped to breathe, which only made her cry harder. Her panic-stricken mind desperately searched for some miracle that might provide salvation. Maybe someone would see them and report it to the police, she thought. But then she remembered the tinted windows and lapsed into self-pity. It's not fair, she thought. I'm not a bad person. I don't deserve to die. But when she thought about how she treated Robert and her family, she had to admit that she wasn't a very good person after all. In her feverish state, Shannon was haunted by the image of the old man they had framed in Wilmington. As her thoughts turned to her family, she tried to recall the religion her father had worked so hard to instill in her. She mentally bargained with God, promising to change her life and be a better person if only he would spare her. Despite her efforts, she couldn't remember any prayers and finally slumped down in her seat, overwhelmed with despair. From her side, she heard a sound and realized Darren was whimpering. And to think I thought he was a bad boy, she raged to herself. The car went around a curve, causing her to shift on the seat, and the pain from her bruised hip reminded her of Darren's cowardly attempt to flee without her. She silently began cursing him and herself for her fascination with him. Abruptly, the car made a sharp turn, and the vibrations from the tires indicated they had turned onto an unpaved road. A new jolt of terror surged through Shannon. We're at the landfill, she thought, and began sodding again. The SUV abruptly braked to a stop, almost throwing Shannon into the seat in front of her. The door beside her was thrown open, and she shrieked as she felt hands groping her legs. "Hold still," a gruff voice ordered. The plastic band around her ankles fell off, and then a hand grabbed her, pulling her from the car. The unknown abductor led her forward, and she could hear Darren shuffling alongside her. They stumbled over the rough ground for about 20 yards, and then stopped. Strong hands gripped her shoulders and forced her down on her knees. The ground was rocky, but in her fear, Shannon hardly noticed. A voice to one side asked, "How much longer?" 5 minutes max, came the reply. At first, Shannon was perplexed, but then the awful truth hit her. She had less than 5 minutes to live. She started to slump to the ground, but a hand roughly pulled her back up. As she knelt there shivering in terror, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Suddenly, light flooded through the loose weave of the burlap. It must be the car headlights, she thought, and then she shrieked as she felt a hand at the back of her head. At that instant, the bag was yanked off her head. In the blinding light, all she could see were a pair of legs standing in front of her. "Is this what you wanted?" a bitter voice rang out. Shannon gasped. That sounds like Robert's voice. Is this really the life you wanted, living like a common criminal, always on the run with someone like him? The voice asked again. Now Shannon knew she was right. Robert's voice dropped to a level, but was raw with emotion. "I would have given you anything, Shannon, done anything to make you happy. I would have taken a bullet for you." She could do nothing but hang her head in shame and misery. "Here," he said sharply. When she looked up, she saw him reach into the inside pocket of his jacket. Instinctively, she flinched, but instead of the pistol she feared, he pulled out an envelope and threw it on the ground in front of her. "Since you wanted it so badly," "Here are your divorce papers," he said bitterly. He stared at her for a minute, then looked around at the others. "I'm done here. You can have the two of them now," he said, and walked away from the kneeling pair. One of the other figures standing outside the circle of light spoke up. "All right, people, the show's over. Let's get back to work." Shannon and Darren were pulled to their feet, their hands still bound behind them, and led to the SUV. They were maneuvered into the back seat, and someone dumped the envelope in Shannon's lap. Minutes later, they were on the highway heading southeast. Darren was the first to recover from the ordeal, and in an angry voice demanded, "What the hell was that all about?" The figure in the passenger seat of the front row turned around, and Shannon was surprised to see that it was an attractive African-American woman. "That was a little professional courtesy we provided to a fellow FBI agent who wanted a chance to confront his ex-wife," she said. "We decided to add the theatrics." "The FBI," Darren sneered. "I should have known. How long have you been after us?" The agent laughed. "Hell, you two are just little fish in a big pond. We weren't even after you. We were using you as bait to get the real bad guys, the Russian mafia. We rounded up the whole lot of them this afternoon." Comprehension dawned in Darren's eyes, and he angrily snapped, "You were the ones who took the money from the storage locker." The woman grinned at him. "Of course we took it. Evidence, you know." Darren glared at her with hatred. "You a hole. You stupid schmuck. You should be thanking us. If we hadn't arrested them." The agent shot back. "Your friends, the Russians, were planning to off the two of you as soon as you got the money out of the storage locker. We've had you and them under surveillance for a long time. We heard them plan it." Shannon gasped, and Darren's bravado evaporated. After a while, Shannon asked, "Where are we going now?" The agent looked at her for the first time. "Why, the Essex County Jail, of course," the agent said. "What did you expect?" Shannon's face drooped to her chest. The agent glanced back and forth at the pair in the back seat, then turned to Shannon with a puzzled look. "Why in the world would you leave Robert Cunningham for this little piece-off?" Shannon couldn't meet her eyes. "I guess I always had a thing for bad boys." "What bad boy?" the agent asked contemptuously. "You mean that little coward with the wet pants?" Shannon glanced over and saw the crotch of Darren's jeans was soaked. When Darren saw her looking, he turned his face away to stare out the window. The agent driving the car swore. He pissed himself. "Damn, I'm going to have to clean the back seat again." The female agent laughed and then turned back to Shannon. "You wanted a bad boy?" she asked scornfully. "You were married to one of the baddest FBI agents on the East Coast. That man has more decorations for bravery than most agents hope for in an entire career. Your ex-husband has taken down mob bosses, bank robbers, and serial killers, and you wanted a bad boy." "I never knew," Shannon said in a small voice. "Yeah, you didn't know," the woman said harshly. "And you nearly killed him. A lot of us thought he wasn't going to make it after you ran out on him. That man loved you so much, and you treated him like he was trash on the street." She took a deep breath to calm herself. "But after tonight, I think he'll be okay. And when he's back on the market, there are a lot of single ladies in the bureau who are going to be after him. You know what? I might just be one of them." The agent behind the wheel gave a mock groan. "Damn, Alice, I thought you were hot for me." The female agent laughed and playfully cuffed his shoulder. "Shut up, Reeve. You know your wife would skin you alive if she heard you talking like that." Before she could say anything more, the driver announced, "We're here," and made a sharp turn into the admitting area of the blue-painted complex of the Essex County Correctional Facility. Shannon and Darren were escorted into the building and led down a corridor. As they walked along the fluorescent-lit hallway, the female agent took Shannon's arm and pulled her off to the right, away from Darren. They came to an empty holding cell. After the agent directed Shannon inside, she slammed the door shut and left. Shannon slumped down on the cot chained to the wall, trying to process everything that had happened. The adrenaline rush of the sting on Sermon, The terror of imminent death, the flood of relief when she realized she would live, and the shame of Robert's confrontation had left her emotionally exhausted. Thinking about how Darren had abandoned her to try to save himself, she felt a sense of relief at being separated from him. Even if he hadn't tried to abandon me, she thought, his Russian friends would have killed us. How could I ever have been tempted to run away with someone like him? She reviled herself and then recalled what the female FBI agent had told her about Robert. It was clear that the woman had a completely different view of the man she had married. She thinks he's a hero, Shannon marveled. She thinks he's hot. A clang from somewhere in the building caused her to look up, and the sight of the barred door reminded her of the future she faced. The thought of spending years in prison was deeply depressing, and the worst of it was that she had no one to blame but herself. Suddenly, the female agent reappeared at the bars, unlocked the cell door, and beckoned to Shannon. "Come on," she said, leading Shannon down a corridor that ended at a door. When she opened it, cool night air hit Shannon's face. They were in the parking lot, and a car was waiting with the engine running. Shannon looked back at the agent in confusion. "What's happening?" The agent simply motioned her toward the waiting vehicle. Then the door opened, and a familiar figure got out. "Daddy!" Shannon cried out in disbelief. When she saw that it was indeed her father, she dashed to him and threw her arms around him, sobbing into his lapels. "I'm so sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry for everything." "Let go, honey," he said, his voice choked with emotion. She let him lead her to the passenger side of his car. "Where are we going?" she asked. "We're going home, honey," he said gently. "But I don't understand," she said plaintively. "Why am I free? How did you know to come get me here?" As her father pulled out onto Doris Avenue and headed toward the on-ramp for the New Jersey Turnpike, he glanced over at his prodigal daughter. "Robert called me," he said. "He asked me to give you a message. He said, tell her this is a parting gift from SpongeBob." Shannon gave a little cry of pain and began to weep again. She couldn't decide whether her unexpected and wholly undeserved redemption was an act of kindness by Robert or the harshest punishment he could have inflicted on her.